Before I introduce the next speaker, I just want to reiterate what I said at the beginning, that we are truly sort of multidisciplinary at Breaking Convention, and often these events, the medical and the therapeutic applications of psychedelics are really focused on. It's a super important area, but I think we forget how most of us came to this. Like, most of us here probably took a psychedelic at a festival or with friends. It's always been a social and recreational environment through dancing and through fun, right? The recreational always gets left out of the conversation, I think. And we all like having fun, and yeah, most of us are here through that route, I think. So this is how this whole session, the Psychedelic Communitas session, kind of was born from that, okay, how are we going to cover this? And Chiara the next speaker, has spoken on this a lot, and I was just very inspired about, her work that she's already done, and I invited her to speak today about this. So Chiara, would you like to please come to the stage? And welcome, Chiara. Because, yeah, I'm really, this is just such an important area, and I'm really looking forward to the sort of story that she's going to take us through, and then we'll hear from another speaker, and then the questions for this will be left at the end of the session. We'll have a panel discussion. So there's a running theme through this whole session, and I'm just really pleased that Chiara's kicking it off with this really important point. So thank you, Chiara.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? So thank you, Amy. Thank you to the curatorial team at Breaking Convention. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be here. I've been coming since 2013, so this is one of the places I am privileged to call home. And yeah, so this talk was conceived as a reflection on what I had the privilege to experience as a curator of the cultural area of two main countercultural festivals in Europe. Boom Festival in Portugal from the psytrance scene. Someone has been there? And Fusion Festival from the German techno-punk scene. Have you been there? So I wanted to make sense of a certain dynamics I was observing in terms of the cultural identities of these festivals and their origins. From there, I developed a broader analysis of the values, principles, and objectives that arose within the 60s counterculture and their resonance with today's festivals, especially in Europe. So because of the complexity of the territory I want to analyze, I will need to make some generalizations, use sweeping statements. Not always I will be able to adopt a nuanced discourse, but nuances and contradictions are there, and the map is not the territory. I felt, however, it could be useful to draw a general overview of the past and use it as a reference when looking at the present and thinking about the future of festivals. This is a work in progress, certainly not the final words on these topics, so feedback is always welcome. Also, I am a white, Italian, cisgendered woman, a neo-pagan, progressive, feminist psytrancer from Gen X. So an identity that carries both potential and limitations, which will be reflected in my perspective. I also have extensively studied mystery religions like the Eleusinian mysteries and especially the cult of Dionysus, which also offer interesting insights into cultural currents that resist dominant oppressive narratives by way of dancing to repetitive beats, ingestion of psychotropics. I could not mention this, but I will only make brief references to it. But if you're interested, I invite you to follow my work. So let's start. What is the counterculture? A counterculture is a culture whose values and norms of behavior differ substantially from those of mainstream dominant cultural customs, with accompanying hope for a better life or a new society. Counterculture is sometimes conceptualized in terms of generational conflict. And this bit about the generational conflict, we'll get back to it later. So during the late 60s, the hippies became the largest and most visible countercultural movement in history because of its huge influence across the globe. They became the counterculture. So they're not the only counterculture, but they are the biggest and most influential until now. So the mother of all countercultural festivals, of course, was Woodstock 69. Far from being the only festival, it was the most representative of that era. Close to 500,000 people, from the perspective of event production, this was no less than a miracle. Still largely unmatched in terms of cultural influence, a landmark for a whole generation because it supported the creation and spreading of a new identity with its distinctive values, beliefs, and practices. All of which would have probably been impossible without the incredible rock music produced in those years and its function as a formidable career of a revolutionary ethos. So how did we get here? And how did we get from here to here? This is just general modern festival. So, generationally speaking, the original hippies are the boomers. They get a bad rep these days, but they were off to a good start. They grew up both at the peak of the Cold War and at the peak of standardized consumerism, a time of unprecedented wealth and abundance, but also unprecedented fear of total annihilation, which interestingly we are experiencing again now. Also a time of hyper-normalization, a term used as the title of a documentary by Adam Curtis that I advise you to see. So if you complied, what is hyper-normalization? If you complied to a series of very strict and generally patriarchal social rules, material abundance would automatically bring happiness for everyone. And we'll get back to that Coca-Cola later. So, baby boomers, born between 1946 and 64, used their privilege to say, this is not happiness. We want something more authentic, original, peaceful, spiritual, individualized, not standardized, and we want this for everyone. We want collective liberation from the system of oppression, from consumerism, from patriarchy, from institutionalized religion, etc. To sum it up, it was a rebellion against any form of traditional authority and the possibility to imagine and put into practice a totally different reality, as we can see. So the hippie counterculture was a movement of movements. And this is important for us to keep in mind. The political side consisted of a strong pacifist movement calling for the end of the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and any war. This that you see here was the biggest demonstration ever happened back then in the USA. And here we see a few more slides with their slogans. So the political side is also generally associated with the New Left, which centered their campaigns around free speech, the ability to lead on campus protests and demonstrations. And we know what's happening in these days with the students of Columbia University, which they have been arrested in the biggest amount since 1968. So, and the civil rights movement. started by people of color to abolish racial segregation in the 50s, and then expanded to include the abolishment of discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, etc., which had an enormous resonance across the globe. Here we see the Gay Liberation Front triggered by the Stonewall riots, which were widely supported, in the sense they supported the gay liberation, by heterosexual people, planting the seed of the modern LGBTQA+ movement. The women liberation, this is a bit more of the gay liberation movement. So, this is in Bristol. So the women liberation movement, known as second wave feminism, starting in the US and spreading all over the Western world like wildfire, profoundly changing the role of women in society, even if it ended up benefiting white women more than any other ethnicity. And here we see Italy, Iceland, France, Australia, Brazil. So the battle to end racism was part of the hippie movement, inspired by Martin Luther King and the peaceful protests in the 50s, like those in Selma. Parallel to this were the Black and indigenous-led liberation movements, the seed of what is today Black Lives Matter and the decolonization movement. But there was also an ecological side, and many important environmental initiatives were born in that period. Then there was a spiritual side, stemming from a critique to Christianity as the only path to the divine. This gave rise to the practice of alternative spiritualities, like Western esotericism, astrology, tarot, Eastern philosophies, neo-paganism, indigenous revivalism, neo-shamanism. And I just signal here that the use of the term indigenous when referring to Westerners is problematic, and also generally the use of the term shamanic. But they all formed a so-called cultic milieu that from the 90s on was generally referred to as the New Age. Then, of course, psychedelics were a big part of this revolution. The movement fueled the use of psychedelics and vice versa. Much can be said, and is said in this conference, luckily, but the important bit to understand here is that the set and setting of the use of psychedelics in the 60s were the values of civil rights, pacifism, collective liberation. So that's what psychedelics amplified as non-specific amplifiers. So these souls were intertwined in a complex and very ambiguous relationship. Some people did not care about spirituality or politics. They were in only for psychedelics and free sexuality, the more hedonistic side of it. But also politically, it was not homogeneous. There were strong disagreements between different ideologies and different opinions on the level of radicality which should be implemented. But I want to point out that the hippie movement was a broad umbrella under which different identities and struggles found their home, and this was one of their strengths. This collective identity made of a plurality of possibilities and directions. So the hippie counterculture ended up being extremely influential from a cultural perspective. So if today students can strike, yeah, long hair is communism, if you didn't know. So, so when you grow older and some guys lose their head, what happens? Lose their hair, what happens? So if today's students can strike and occupy schools, if workers can unionize, if women can divorce, are free to choose over their bodies, where they still can, and free to dress as they wish, if we can have sex before marriage without losing our reputation, and this is huge. We give it for granted, but this was a huge change, especially for women. If there are food co-ops, if we have equal access to the internet and much, much more, this list could go on and on. Whether or not we identify as hippies today, we owe these freedoms to the hippies. So as someone said, they are the ancestors we cannot get rid of. So this success was the reason why capitalism morphed to become attractive to the new revolutionary consumers. You can be a revolutionary, but you're still a consumerist, right? Do you want the revolution? We sell you the revolution. So this tendency is exemplified in this 1972 Coca-Cola ad. Let's see if it starts. Do I have to do something? So it's the real thing, right? So this is so catchy. Were you singing along? It's impossible not to sing along. I've had it in my head the whole day. So here we witness the strategy of associating something that hippies liked and wanted, diversity, utopia, harmony, peace and love, with corporate products. And in many cases, in many ways, this kind of operation is the beginning of the end. But if you look under this video on YouTube, in the comments, people are still raving about how good this ad was and how amazing it was. Like, you messed up with your heads and we just want more because it's so good. So in the mid-70s and 80s, the winds started to change. Politically, we witnessed the conservative backlash or the counter-revolution, which brought an end to utopia. This period saw the implementation of ruthless neoliberalism, leading to increased poverty, unemployment, and deterioration of income distribution. Of course, more politicians were involved in this operation than these two. But so, what happened to the counterculture, to their music, to their festivals? In this period, the main urban counterculture was punk. They're quite strong here in the UK. Mainly working class, quite angry, rather depressed, and as an understandable response to bleak living conditions, but with a socio-political activist edge. As you can see, against sexism, racism, homophobia, heteronormativity, strike breakers, transphobia, and pigs, not as the animals. So in this period, I already said. So the punks developed pretty much in antithesis to the hippie movement, according to a very common phenomenon termed by philosopher Gregory Bateson as schismogenesis. This is very common. We do it one-to-one, we do it collectively. It consists of defining one's identity in opposition to the identity of someone else. In this case, both in terms of aesthetics, attitude. Punks were more realistic and less idealistic. Their world was a different place than the world where hippies felt that everything was possible. But so the punks are the ones who brought forward many of the political fights of the 60s, like anti-fascism, feminism, queer rights, often defined as queer core, trans rights, very realistic versus idealistic, rooted in their immediate needs for survival in a patriarchal and consumeristic reality. So the use of different pronouns actually is not woke, it's punk. A connection which is not evident to everyone, highlighting how the use of a derogatory term, the derogatory term woke, which became a derogatory term, is actually aimed at undermining long-standing social justice struggles. So I'm just going to put here this meme, which I've seen being shared by members of the psychedelic and New Age community, which to me is only a testimony of the efficacy of online manipulation aimed at our circles. It's good to apply self-criticism when observing exaggerated attitudes, righteousness, etc., within the social justice movement. But whose interests are we benefiting when we use the same terminology used by conservative media to define social justice activists? I close the parentheses. In the 90s, late 90s, was the time of the anti-globalization or no global movement, aimed at limiting the power of corporations, which was met by brutal police repression. This was the traumatic beginning of my political activism, together with many from Gen X. So in this phase, the counterculture went underground, but was still very much alive, especially here in the UK, France, Germany, Holland, in raves, free parties, squats, techno with a K, with a marked anti-consumeristic and anarchist ethos. These initiatives reclaimed free spaces that would function outside of consumeristic and corporate dynamics, like the temporary autonomous zones, or TAZ. If you're interested to deepen this part, please listen to the talk that my colleague Georgia Gaia gave last year's edition. It's on YouTube. So the oldest, biggest festival of reference for the punk techno culture in Europe is Fusion Festival. 70,000 people, born in East Germany in the late 90s. Its ethos retained a sharp anti-capitalist, queer feminist punk edge, with a strong focus on supporting the political activism of the different groups constituting their wider community. Of course, they are totally independent and have no corporate sponsors. They don't like to be talked about very much, so I will just quote from their website to get a feeling of their mission. Far from everyday life, we celebrate 4 days of a parallel society of a special kind, looking for a possibly better world. Remember, this is from the definition of counterculture. We know that there's always a but. We also feel that there's no real place where all of this comes true. Nevertheless, or exactly because of it, it is important that fusionists from all corners of the continent meet in this very place. They feel what makes us all brothers and sisters, the desperate search for more than this life can offer. It's all that we want, and we want it now, right now. See, it's a bit hippie also, definitely countercultural. They also don't self-identify as psychedelic, even if they might consume psychedelics, or transformational. This is still connected to the schismogenesis effect. But also, I cannot not mention the underground techno scene in Berlin, which is rooted around the same anti-patriarchal, queer feminist, anti-consumeristic, anti-fascist values. And what an amazing achievement for the European counterculture that the Berlin techno scene has been added to the country's list of intangible cultural heritage in recognition of its contribution to the cultural identity of Berlin. This is amazing. So let's take a step back. What happened to the hippies?
We're still here.
So, but back in the late 70s and early 80s, many fled to India to take care of their inner journey, where they felt that they had more agency than the agency they could have on the outer world. So, according to some researchers, this was the reason for this deep focus on the inner journey, where they feel I can still make change happen, if not outside, at least inside. So if I change, the world will change, right? So peace within, peace throughout, let there be peace and let it begin with me. If it was really true fully, maybe now we would be in a better place in terms of war. So change yourself to change the world. This is the motto I grew up with. And it's not true, it's just that it's partially true. Inner work usually can change the world around you. But if not paired with political awareness and activism, it might actually contribute to maintaining the status quo. Even if at the same time inner work is fundamental for the revolutionaries. So they went on the hippie trail and they landed in Goa. So what did they do in Goa? Let's hear from themselves, like why were they in Goa? And this is a quote from a little zine called The Stoned Pig that was published in 1975. So we're all here because we believe that the world outside has been lost to the forces of opportunity and power. The men and spirit of the outside world are not concerned with freedom, love, dance, and all the things that bring wisdom and happiness to us here in Goa. But they seem to be in love with contraction, to close themselves within the walls of their concrete cities and minds, to oppress all forms of harmony with our Mother Nature. We've all been aware of this for quite some time. We've chosen an alternate place and space in our lives and on this planet, and that is Goa. Great. Really good, but they left politics behind. So in Goa, the hippies dedicated themselves to yoga, meditation, and LSD-fueled full moon parties. So from psychedelic rock with the influence of electronic music coming from Germany, Ibiza, etc., they gave birth to a new genre called Goa trance first and psytrance later in the early 2000s. Yeah, this is from the psychedelic rock to the first DJs. However, it's important to state that most, if not all, the music that accompanied the Western countercultural movement, rock, punk, disco, acid house, techno, all come from music styles invented and pioneered by people of color. I cannot go too much into this, but it's good to remember that counterculture doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a context of specific power dynamics of appropriation. Could it be that even the counterculture bears the stamp of these dynamics even when it tries to liberate itself from it? Food for thought. So Goa trance parties were a mix of escapism, hedonism, and mysticism. And from my perspective, the highlighting of the mystical potential of modern celebration is actually very revolutionary and has important consequences. In fact, in my research on Dionysus, practices like dancing over repetitive beats and ingestion of mind-altering beverages was at the core of their spiritual practice. And yeah, dancing together under the influence or not of substances, this is considered a biotechnology of group formation. This is a quote from Barbara Ehrenreich, Dancing in the Streets. So yeah, this is where communitas, this is how communitas are born, with these practices. It's really the recreational tag is very limiting, as we can see. So there was a lot of diversity in terms of nationalities. It was an important moment when youths from all westernized countries finally got to see each other as brothers and sisters after the world wars, and this must have been amazing. In terms of social status, many, even if not all, of these hippies belonged to the middle to upper class. There were many black sheep of wealthy families whose act of rebellion consisted of living together naked on the beach. So, in the 90s, out of the Goa trance scene, many psychedelic trance festivals were born in various parts of the world. In Europe, we have Boom Festival. This is the first flyer from '97. I think there's someone here who was there. So WUV Experience already in '91, later Ozora, just to mention a few, but there's hundreds of them, not just in Europe, but everywhere in the world. So this lineage is the one that continues more explicitly the psychedelic culture of the 60s and contributes to updating it to modern time in terms of psychedelic. So the cultural pillars of these festivals are psychedelics, both in aesthetic, but also the promotion of conscious use, harm reduction spaces, also ecology and sustainability, regeneration, pioneered by Boom in the early 2000s and really one of its biggest achievements. Thank God that that happened, because now many festivals are also being inspired to be consciously sustainable. Also New Age spirituality and practices, which sometimes often are appropriated and risk to be commodified. In some cases, there is still a certain no corporate logos and no corporate sponsors ethos, which defines these events as independent. But in general, it's a spiritual but not political kind of context. And in times like this, where political neutrality is questioned, does it really exist? This can carry its own sets of challenges. On the positive side, however, I would like to remember that the cultural areas in psychedelic festivals like Liminal Village in Boom, which was born in 2004, and there had been some similar experiments in the editions before. So this could be considered a precursor of psychedelic conferences, supporting, for example, the legalization efforts in the therapeutic field. Here we have Rick Doblin giving a talk in 2012, but many others joined over the years. And also, cultural areas were fundamental for the spreading of psychedelic science to the people that come to festivals. Also, harm reduction spaces. This is, it looks better now, but I wanted to honor the humble origins of something great. So, harm reduction space is pioneered again in psychedelic festivals like Cosmic Care in Boom in the early 2000s, contributed to inspiring and educating hundreds of psychedelic therapists, right? Maybe someone here had that experience and was inspired. So, these festivals provide essential networking spaces for the whole psychedelic community and the ultimate experience of what a psychedelic culture could look like. It's a temporary autonomous zones. We set our rules there, our principles. So thus constituting a fundamental contribution to the psychedelic renaissance. It's not true that ravers and hippies are not contributing and only scientists and therapists are contributing. We are all one community. So can we really talk about recreational use only? Of course, I cannot not mention Burning Man, which is another example of a big, very big, initially very countercultural event based on the 10 principles, and now with some offshoots here in Europe and elsewhere. The question is it now able to maintain that countercultural edge with the invasion of the ultra-rich and related issues? It's a challenge that they are facing. And a similar challenge, even if not connected maybe to the invasion of the ultra-rich in the same way as in California, so similar but different, and maybe also due just to the passing of time, something similar has happened here in the Glastonbury Festival. Originally very countercultural, but later also undergoing a process of commodification, which can also be normal. You know, I'm not questioning the producers. Big festivals are submitted to a very strong bureaucratic pressure to function, and so it's very difficult to maintain certain principles and ways of doing things. I don't know how I'm doing with the time, but I'm already with the conclusive statements. So, my wish is that at least some festivals, and maybe even new ones, can continue the tradition of committing to spreading countercultural values beyond profit-driven strategies, because yes, festival can be incredibly transformative experiences. People live as different persons. But what kind of different person will depend on the set and setting promoted and supported by the event. So do we want festivals to be laboratories where another world is possible, to use the slogan of the No Global movement? Or La La Lands, to escape briefly from the horrors of the world? So do we want to use festivals to change the status quo, or festivals are irrelevant to the status quo? All those socio-political threads that were weaved together in the 60s are still here. Social justice with the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the decolonization movement, the alternative spiritualities, and I want to mention especially the importance of animism that many of us are rediscovering, environmentalism, Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, feminism, queer rights, and of course psychedelics are still here, and even more so. And also the threats, so these were the threads of the 60s, but also the threats that counterculture was fighting against are still here. Nuclear war and any kind of war, patriarchy, corporativization, climate change, misogyny, homophobia, racism, and any form of discriminations, etc., are still here. The difference is that the counterculture is now scattered. There is not one Woodstock anymore. Our communities are a bit separated, often co-opted by consumerism and commodification, plagued by polarizations, and this creates a sense of defragmentation and isolation, which can feel daunting and frustrating, to say the least. The risk for many of us is to drown in hopelessness, or at best, to use festivals and psychedelics exclusively as experiences where to briefly escape from that hopelessness. So what to do? Let me see, I don't remember. My wish is that we can rekindle a sense of kinship with the others, in recognition of the common origin and aims of our struggles, and create events that celebrate that extended kinship. My suggestion is also that we dare to extend that kinship even further, beyond the West, to countercultural movements in Arab, Asian, African, Latin countries, First Nations, ex-Soviet nations, for example, Georgia and Azerbaijan, where local techno scenes have led incredible revolutionary actions in these past few years. The next global countercultural movement might not be led by Westerners. Wouldn't that be amazing? And will we be able to dance to their tunes, literally and metaphorically, with humility, respect, enthusiasm, and true solidarity. So the solution, if there is any, is not about stitching the hippies together with the punks or even the hipsters in a Frankenstein-esque operation. It's more about finding new ways to weave previous countercultural threads, to create new patterns, new identities, new alliances, build new bridges, new festivals, new music styles, on the basis of those common values that in the past inspired millions of people to change the world for the better. So to paraphrase Audre Lorde, revolution is not a one-time, one place, one music, one people kind of event. So as the hippies would say, together we can make magic happen, and gods know how much we need that magic now. Thank you.